In the 2nd century AD, Roman soldiers originally assigned to grain supply routes began filing reports that had nothing to do with wheat. Names, destinations, overheard conversations. Without a formal announcement or decree, the frumentari had quietly become something else, and most of the empire never knew they existed. The word frumentari comes from frumentum, Latin for grain. In the early decades of the Roman imperial period, these were soldiers assigned to the logistics of grain distribution across the empire's military network. They moved between legions and supply depots, tracked shipments, and kept records. On the surface, it was administrative work, practical, unglamorous, and easy to overlook. But the job carried something far more useful than grain: freedom of movement. A frumentarius could cross provincial borders without explanation. He had standing reasons to interact with local officials, merchants, landowners, and garrison commanders. He understood roads, ports, and trade routes better than most soldiers ever would. And he did all of this with just enough institutional authority to move without restriction, but not enough prominence to attract suspicion. By the late 1st and into the 2nd century AD, the emperors who sat in Rome had begun to see what this mobility could mean. The empire was enormous. Its frontier stretched from the Sahara to the Scottish lowlands, from the Atlantic coast to the edges of Mesopotamia. Keeping it stable required more than armies and governors. It required knowing what was actually happening in the provinces before problems became crises. The frumentari became that mechanism. What started as a supply function was quietly repurposed into an imperial intelligence operation centered at the Castra Peregrina, a military compound on the Caelian Hill in Rome. Agents stationed there coordinated reports from across the provinces, and their findings reached the emperor directly, bypassing provincial governors and standard military hierarchy entirely. There was no proclamation, no public record of the shift. The transformation happened through reassignment, through expanded access, through quiet institutional creep. A frumentarius in the field looked like any other soldier on detached duty. He wore no special insignia. He carried military credentials that explained his presence in almost any context. He was delivering dispatches, escorting prisoners, coordinating supply lines, escorting imperial correspondence. The cover was built into the role itself, and that was precisely what made it effective. In practice, their work fell into several overlapping categories. Some frumentari were tasked with tracking individuals: senators, provincial governors, military officers, anyone whose loyalty was considered uncertain or whose influence had grown uncomfortable. Others gathered economic intelligence: grain prices, trade disruptions, hoarding, local shortages that might signal deeper unrest. Others still were used to deliver, or quietly ensure the delivery of, imperial orders that required discretion rather than ceremony. They also served as the empire's extradition arm. When fugitives or political exiles needed to be found and returned to Rome, frumentari were often the ones sent to retrieve them. This gave them access to local informant networks, municipal records, and relationships with regional officials that deepened over time and across assignments. Reports flowed back to the Castra Peregrina in Rome, where they were compiled and reviewed before reaching the emperor or his closest advisors. The compound itself housed rotating agents from legions across the empire, men on temporary assignment to the capital who brought direct knowledge of their home provinces with them. It functioned less like a formal intelligence headquarters and more like a continuously updated map of imperial vulnerabilities. The system was never written into law as a surveillance apparatus. It didn't need to be. As long as frumentarii held legitimate military status and moved through existing institutional channels, their actual function remained invisible to most of those being watched. For the people who suspected they were being watched, there was no reliable way to confirm it. That uncertainty was part of how the system worked. A neighbor who asked too many questions might be curious, or might be filing reports. A soldier passing through town for the 3rd time in a year might be following a supply route. or following someone. The frumentari didn't need to be everywhere to be effective. They only needed people to believe they might be. This ambient suspicion reshaped behavior inside the empire in ways that were difficult to measure, but impossible to ignore. Senators became careful with their dinner guests. Provincial governors weighed their correspondence. Military commanders thought twice before voicing frustration with imperial policy. The network functioned partly through actual surveillance and partly through the fear of it, and the two were often indistinguishable from the inside. For those directly targeted, the experience was more concrete and considerably more dangerous. Being identified as a person of interest to the frumentari rarely ended with a warning. It could mean interrogation, arrest, exile, or execution, depending on the political climate of the reign and the temperament of the emperor being served. Under rulers like Domitian and later Caracalla, the network was used aggressively against perceived enemies, real and imagined. Accusations that passed through frumentari channels carried institutional weight that was difficult to challenge. At the same time, the agents themselves existed in a complicated position. They operated largely alone, away from their home legions, embedded in cities and provinces where they had no organic loyalty. Some developed genuine relationships with the communities they monitored. Others abused their access for personal gain. Extortion, bribery, and settling local scores were documented complaints. The line between imperial intelligence and individual corruption was thin and frequently crossed. By the 3rd century, the resentment had become difficult to contain. The word frumentarius had started to carry a meaning its original logistics function never intended. Something closer to spy, informer, threat. The end of the frumentari came not from exposure or rebellion, but from replacement. In the early 4th century, the Emperor Diocletian formally disbanded the unit, a decision that, on the surface, read as reform. The frumentari had become too visible, too associated with abuse, and too resented across the provinces to function effectively as a covert apparatus. Their reputation had outgrown their usefulness. But Diocletian didn't dismantle the intelligence function itself. He rebuilt it under a different name. The agentes in rebus, loosely translated as those who handle affairs, took over the operational role with a restructured mandate and a cleaner institutional image. They were better organized, more formally integrated into the imperial bureaucracy, and considerably more difficult to dismiss as a simple corruption problem. The surveillance continued. Only the label changed. This pattern, dissolve, rename, rebuild, says something worth noting about how the Roman state understood information as an instrument of control. The frumentari were never the result of a single emperor's paranoia. They grew from a practical need, expanded through institutional opportunity, and persisted because the empire genuinely could not govern its own scale without them. Disbanding them didn't reflect a change in philosophy. It reflected a change in method. Their legacy runs in two directions. In the history of statecraft, the frumentari represent one of the earliest documented examples of a standing internal intelligence network operating inside a complex imperial system. Not as a temporary wartime measure, but as a permanent feature of governance. In the history of Roman society, they represent something more uncomfortable. The point at which the machinery of the state became something its own citizens had learned to fear in silence. The grain routes had always moved information. It just took Rome a while to make that official.